Okay, a little bit of a slideshow on Roman religion. Just kind of go over some basic elements. And what I'm kind of doing here is kind of like what I did earlier in this unit with the look at the Roman household. There's going to be obviously some overlap with some of the Greek religious beliefs that we've talked about and some of the practices. So I'll kind of quickly review some of that. But really, what I want to focus on is how things in Rome are a little bit different. And also just to kind of flesh out some of the details that are given in your chapter, which is actually pretty good at giving an overall kind of introduction to Roman religion. Okay. So if we think about, we took a look at religion in Greece, some of the gods that were worshipped, how they did it, using sacrifice and prayer and so on, the use of the festivals and so on. And when we take a look, compare things between Greece and Rome, of course, there's a lot of similarities, right? Even the gods are very similar, all right? I'll kind of give you some examples here, but for example, we're familiar with Zeus in Greece. His equivalent in Rome is Jupiter, right? And the same thing, we've learned a lot about Athena. In Greek culture, she's called Minerva. In Roman culture, she's called Minerva, excuse me. So there's a lot of similarity. So a lot of the gods are the same, all right? So we do see Greek influence here. Now, that's not to say Jupiter and Zeus are the same, but the Greeks, most cultures have some sort of kind of dominant sky god, as we've seen. So it just happened to be kind of the Roman one. And no doubt, ultimately, there's kind of probably some sort of shared history there. But remember, there was Greek colonies in Italy. So from a very early age in their history, Romans were exposed to Greek gods. And we do know that, especially when Rome started to expand, say, within Italy and came into contact with other communities, sometimes they'd run into a Greek god that they didn't have an equivalent for. So they kind of imported that god. An example here is Apollo. There's no kind of Roman equivalent of Apollo. So he was kind of, in a sense, just taken over. And that's why, in Roman terms, and he became a very important Roman god, very important to Augustus, but he retained the same name, Apollo. The same thing goes when Romans expanded within Italy and came into contact with some other Italian communities. Gods, Juno there is actually an Italian goddess that was kind of adopted. But then, as time goes on, they start to see um, overlap with the Greek Demeter. So there's some kind of cross contamination there, if you will. But a lot of the gods are going to be very similar, just maybe a different name. And some of the stuff I'm describing to you really shouldn't surprise us that much because we've talked about Rome being a very kind of inclusive culture. That is, when they say conquered people, for example, if they saw that something that was useful or that could benefit them, they were quite quick to take it over and exploit it. This is true of, say, military techniques. It's true of literature, and it's also true of religious beliefs. Okay, so that's to say. That being said, a lot of the gods that we see, you'll be familiar to one extent or another. Some are maybe more prominent. Here's Mars. Remember, Mars is the father of Romulus and Remus, excuse me. So he has a particularly important kind of role in Roman myth. He's also the war god. All right. Ares is the equivalent in Greece. But of course, because of the importance of the military in Roman life, Mars kind of becomes more important. We've seen him in Roman culture, right? Remember his seduction, if you will, or kind of forcing himself, his rape of Rhea Silvia to produce Romulus and Remus. Here's Jupiter, right? If I said this was Zeus, you'd probably believe me too, because it looks just like what we've seen with Zeus. In other words, he's seated, usually in a kind of royal pose, like on a throne. He has his eagle there. He has a scepter. He has a symbol of victory in his right hand, right? All those kind of things are familiar from Zeus too, right? And that shouldn't surprise us. Kind of typical kind of sky god and so forth. His wife, kind of Juno, she's actually a goddess of, she's connected with childbirth, right? So you see here, that shouldn't surprise us too much. She's the kind of quintessential wife, if you will, just kind of like how Hera is with Zeus. So as to say, a lot of the gods and goddesses that we're going to come across, they'll be very, very similar. They might just have a different name. For example, Hera becomes Juno, or Zeus, in a sense, becomes Jupiter. Now I'm kind of oversimplifying things because, of course, there are differences there, but it's pretty, as to say, there's a lot of similarity too. Okay. Just as I say here, the pantheon of gods, we're comparing with Greece, just meaning the selection of gods that we see, all these different people, upper world, lower world, and all that kind of stuff, they'll be familiar with to us. So that's not that different. Other things that are kind of familiar from Greece is that this sacred versus secular distinction, kind of church and state, if we think about it in modern terms, that just didn't exist. Okay, there was no kind of priestly class in a sense. Politicians served as priests, right? There just wasn't that sort of distinction. And also the idea of the festival or communal worship, that was a common factor in Greece, as it will be in Roman practice. Prayers, obviously key, and sacrifice of animals, just as they were in Greece. So as to say, in terms of the gods that were worshipped, some of this kind of conventions and so on, and the format of worship was very, very similar between Greece and Rome. So you're kind of familiar with that. Okay. So here now, as to say, that being said, I do want to take a look at some things that are more kind of distinctively Roman. Okay. And here, one of the first things I want to take a look at in terms of Roman beliefs is this belief in what are known as the Penates, or say the Lares. Now, these are two different types of spirits or gods, although there is a fair bit of kind of overlap between them. Okay. Penates, it actually comes from the word meaning the innermost part of the house. And these are these spirits that are kind of connected with the pantry, with the hearth, and just generally the success of the household. Okay, so you'd worship them. They kind of take care of you. The people that lived in your house, they provide kind of abundance of food and all that kind of stuff. Now the Lares weren't so much connected, say, with the pantry and the hearth, although they're kind of connected with the house. But it seems they're more connected, say, kind of family gods, or they're kind of the ancestors of the household who are now kind of worshipped as gods. Okay, so although these are different, okay, and don't get me wrong, they often both did exist within the household. And as we'll see, I'll show you some examples here. No doubt there's kind of some overlap or interconnection between them. Okay. Now here too, just as I did with the slideshow on the family, I want to look back to this image of Aeneas escaping from Troy. Remember, a very powerful image in Roman culture because it's the idea of, um, intergenerational continuity, a father taking care of his son and his own father, right? So this distinguishes Aeneas and his piety towards his father. But this image also shows what another thing that Aeneas was famous for, and you can see his father on his shoulders, but then it looks like he has this other little man on top of his shoulders. That's actually a statue of um, these Penates, these kind of household gods. And Aeneas is famous for having brought those from Troy to Italy. So he's kind of responsible for doing that. And this is why I didn't mention this at the very beginning, but one thing Aeneas is kind of revered for, he's referred to as Pius Aeneas, meaning pious Aeneas. Now, piety can mean devotion towards family, but of course it also has a religious dimension too. And he is often held up as this extremely pious Roman. Okay, and that was important to the Romans because they saw themselves as a very kind of pious and devout people. So who better as a founder of Rome, in a sense, than Aeneas? All right, and as to say, part of this is kind of exemplified, by the fact that he brought these household gods all the way from Troy to Italy. So therefore, we see examples of these are pictures, frescoes of Aeneas and the household gods accompanying him. The other thing that's interesting is there would be a place for, especially the Lares within a household. So what you would do is you'd have a little shrine set up to them. So that's what this is here. So you can see this is just built into it's probably like a foot or two high. It's built into a wall. This is in Pompeii. And it looks like the front of a little temple. And then what you see in there are the Lares, these kind of deified ancestors. All right. So what you're doing is you're worshiping them, and you put offerings here you can see on the ledge and so on. Okay. And that's is to see, you see the ancestors in the background that you're kind of worshiping. Here's another one here. This is from Pompeii. It's now in the museum, but you can see here's the place where you'd put maybe little statues and offerings. All right, and here's the gods themselves. This is kind of being reconstructed. But also you notice how, take a look at here, this kind of serpent down here, and the other one here. And that's why you see this connected with the Lares, because What you're doing is you're worshiping your ancestors because they've provided for you, and in turn, what you want to do is provide for your successors, right? Now, the snake, in a sense, is a symbol of kind of power and fertility and all those kind of things. But it's also a symbol of regeneration because the snake, of course, constantly is famous for shedding his skin, right? So when ancient people saw the sloughed off skin of a snake, they thought it was kind of being reborn. So there is this idea of a snake kind of constantly undergoing regeneration. That's why often in antiquity you'll see these images, and I'm sure you've seen it, of a snake or a serpent devouring its own tail in the kind of a shape of a circle. That's this image of the kind of life cycle of a snake, this idea of continual regeneration. So that's why we kind of see these associated with the Lares, but of course they're connected with ancestors and successors. The idea here, of course, is that you want this generational continuity. You want your family to continue. So that's really kind of being what's emphasized here, not only through the Lares itself, but also the imagery that's put on it with the snake and other things. Now here's examples of these lares or penates, these little figurines that would represent. So that's why if you see some of these are more known as the penates. And you can see it's just a little figure that you'd put in one of these little shrines and make offerings to them. But you can see they often have, it's called a cornucopia, and those are images of fertility. In other words, you're worshiping these gods so that they will take care of your household and ensure that you can kind of feed yourself, clothe your children, or whatever, right? And here's some others you can see. Very different sizes, of course, but all kind of small enough to be put in there. So that was really, really common, right? This idea of these kind of household spirits or divinities or ancestors who you kind of worshipped, and they'd hopefully in turn take care of you. Now, this kind of is not necessarily connected to, but it leads to another important point about Roman religion. And that is, to a greater degree than in Greek religion, it is kind of permeated by this idea of animism. All right, now that is a term that means to say here this belief that natural and physical objects and processes are endowed with divine properties. So that just means, like, for example, the front door of a house could be endowed with some sort of divine properties or some sort of process like rain, sunshine, all those kind of things. All right. So the Roman belief system saw these kind of spirits and divinities at work in all of the world surrounding them. It really was a world that was populated by these different spirits, right? So we've mentioned household and other things. But what's kind of interesting here is that the places, as I say here, the places and activities to which these gods were attached were exactly those where uncertainty, change, and danger were prevalent. And this makes sense, right? Because, in a sense, why do you worship gods? Because you want to control a situation, or you want to assure success in something. So, of course, you attribute them to those places where these kind of things were threatened. I talked about a door earlier in the other slideshow, right? There were all sorts of divinities, Janus, and even other ones that were connected to the door because it was considered a dangerous place, right? Evil spirits can, in a sense, go to get in, or thieves, or whatever. All right. So when you look at through Roman culture, there are these kind of animistic spirits or divinities circulating all over the place. And not surprising, in an agricultural community, they are often connected with agriculture. The ones that I often hold up as examples just to show how kind of odd this is, but also on the other hand, very understandable, are some of these figures. Take a look at this. Robigus is a divinity, and he is the god of mildew, right? Now, doesn't that kind of strike you as bizarre? Like, we think of having kind of, or at least Christians think of having kind of one God in charge of everything, but they had a god of mildew. That's really weird, right? Like, why, something you see in your shower or whatever, why would there be a God for that? But then when you think about it in an agricultural context, it's actually pretty important because mildew can destroy stored crops, right? And if mildew destroys stored crops, well, then you have nothing to eat over the winter. So you wanted somebody to try to keep that mildew out, in a sense. So that, in a sense, I say it seems really weird, but on the next hand, it's very understandable. They also had a spirit known as Sterculius. He's the god of manure. And that too, like, there's literally a god of shit, right? That's weird on one hand. But on the other hand, right, it actually makes perfect sense because manure was clearly a fundamental key to a successful harvest, right? And if you didn't use it, then you weren't going to be successful. So you wanted people to look after that. Sterculius would be your man. Okay, so that just shows you, as to say, this idea of animism is really, really common in Rome, and I could go on about all sorts of different ones. To say within the household, the door, you had Janus, but then you had the door of the hinge. You had this kind of divinity of what are called the leaves of the door, so actual door itself, and others. One final one I'll leave you with here is cloacina. Now, what a cloaca is a sewer, right? To dispose of, say, human waste and water and so on. And in Rome itself, there was what's known as the Cloaca Maxima, which is the big sewer. And there was, from a very early stage in Roman history, they did dig out a sewer system, which is in fact still being used, parts of it today. And now that's a huge advancement, right? Because if you have, proper hygiene in a city, it helps that urban center expand. So a sewer, to kind of get rid of that waste, which of course poses so many dangers, it's important to have someone in charge of that. And the goddess of the sewer, her name was Cloacina, right? So here you can see what's interesting here is on one side of this coin, you can see this is Concordia, which is like the goddess of concordance, which is like agreement amongst different people in society. But on the other side of it, we see the shrine, and you can see what says on it, Cloacina. Okay, and what this is if you take a look in the Forum at Rome, okay, which has all sorts of temples to Vesta, Jupiter, all sorts, that also had a shrine to the sewer goddess. And it's not much to look at today, right? But I'm just showing this to prove to you that it exists in a sense, right? It's right in the downtown Forum. I've walked by it a lot. Perhaps, and this is kind of based on the coin, it would have looked something like this. So there's a bit of a kind of plinth or platform, and then the statues of the goddess on top of that, at which you would make offerings to ensure that she looks after the sewer system. Okay, so again, we think of our gods as kind of, I don't know, living up in the heavens or whatever, right? But for Romans, it's more kind of these day-to-day things that were key to a successful city and a successful empire. So this animism, that's as to say, I'm not going to say it's absent from Greece, because of course they had a belief in that spirits, but just not to the same sort of degree as we see in Rome. Okay. A couple other things that your textbook talks about, and I'll kind of spend more time in the latter here than the first, because I discuss augury in the material online, right? Augury was another important form of Roman religious practice. Now, remember, when we've talked about prophecy in the past, and a key part of any ancient religions is you wanted to gain the insight of the gods. You wanted to see if they were going to be favorable to what you're about to undertake or something you're about to do in your life and so on. So you wanted to gauge if they were favorable or not. This is why you did sacrifice, right? Hopefully by performing the sacrifice for the god, he or she in turn would return what you asked of them, right? They'd fulfill that kind of promise. Now, another way that you could kind of gauge, the will of the gods is by the flight of birds. And this is a kind of a practice that the Romans took over from the Etruscans. And all this meant is that basically an augur, kind of a priestly office, he'd look up into the sky and he'd look for specific birds. So an eagle was kind of considered, say, a good omen versus a crow or something like that. So the type of bird you saw, how many birds you saw, and from which part of the sky they came from, if they flew out of the east or the west or the left or the right. This is actually where we get the word sinister. Sinister is the word for left, right? Sinistra. So if a bird came from the left, that was considered a bad omen. Right, so it was sinister. So that's very, very common too. And as I say, I explain it more, and it's in your textbook as well. But what maybe doesn't receive the same sort of treatment is the talk about prodigies. This too is kind of unique to Rome. Prodigies were important, right? Something that would happen that was supposed to reveal the will of the gods. We hear a lot about lightning strikes. We hear a lot about kind of fires, if they happen, or the flooding of the Tiber. All these kind of considered bad omens. And then what you had to do is treat it, to expiate it in some way, make an offering to the gods. Right? So a flooding of Tiber, for a lot of Romans, that would say, oh, the gods are angry at us for something that we've done. So we have to expiate this. So what can we do? And then usually be like a certain number of kind of sacrificing animals or whatever. Now, these books of the Sibyl or the Sibylline books. This kind of goes back to the very beginnings of Roman history. Supposedly it goes back to Romulus, but who knows? But the idea was that there was this Sibyl, a kind of female priestess, and she approached Romulus and said, listen, I have these books that talk about all these omens that might happen and what you're supposed to do to treat them. He kind of brushes her off, but then she kind of throws, supposedly originally it was like 10 books, and when he said no, she threw one in the fire and said, oh, okay, how about buying 9? And then she went down until he figured, oh, I should do something, right? Now, in the Sistine Chapel, you can see this Sibyl, you can see with her books there, okay, reading them. So what would happen in Rome is if something really bad happened, a temple burned down, for example, or some of the crazy stuff they hear, like a stillborn baby, that kind of thing, or flooding the Tiber, what they do is they consult these books. And these books were in existence, suppose they went back to Romulus, but they were still being consulted in like 400, 500 AD. All right, it really is quite remarkable, kept in a safe spot. So what they do is there would be a person in charge of it. They consult these books, all right, and then do kind of recommend a course of action. I've got a couple here. There are lots of famous examples when recourse was made to the Sibylline books. Here's just a couple examples so it might show you how they were used. So for example, in 216 BC, remember the war with Hannibal? Well, he inflicted a huge defeat on the Romans at a place called Cannae in 216. Massive, massive defeat, like 70,000 Romans were killed. At that time, that was considered just horrific. So here, after such a disaster, these Sibylline books were consulted, and the recommendation was that 2 Gauls and 2 Greeks should be buried alive in the city's marketplace. Now you can see it's clearly just kind of hokey or whatever, but these are the kind of things that they would have to do. Another one, 295, again, they were consulted after a pandemic or whatever, right? And also there's reports that say that large numbers of Appius Claudius' armies had been struck by lightning. So how do you solve that problem? Well, according to Livy, who's a Roman historian, they had to build a specific temple to Venus. So that would hopefully take care of this pestilence and so forth. Okay, so basically that's what it was. If something bad happened, well, let's consult the books, and they'll tell us what we can do to kind of gain back the goodwill of the gods. So that's very, very common too, and it's very prominent in Roman history. So remember that, and also kind of reread it in your textbook. One last thing I include here, because we're talking, when we talk about religious practices, we've talked about prayer and sacrifice, and then when you take a look at Rome, you'll see kind of more use of augury and prodigies and so forth. But one other thing I wanted to bring up here, because it maybe doesn't have to do with kind of gods, but more kind of spirits. And this maybe will help to kind of emphasize the fact that Romans just saw their world as kind of populated by these spirits. Okay, not only gods and so forth like Jupiter and Mars and all kind of, but just these kind of day-to-day spirits. And this is why we find a lot of these curse tablets, which are known as Defictiones in Latin. Now, what these curse tablets are, and I'll show you some pictures in a second, is that if someone had done something to you, or if you love somebody, or you hated something, you just wanted to get something done, quite often what you do is you get a piece of lead, and you'd scrape on it or write on it what you wanted to be done. You'd say a prayer, and of course there's all these things you had to do, and then you'd bury it in the hopes that it would come true. Okay. Now, a lot of these curse tablets, what they have to do with, someone stole something from me, so I want to get back at them. They have to do with, people that don't feel they were treated justly, or there's people that are in love, and what they want to do is they want to make sure the person returns their love. Now, the idea was that by setting up these curse tablets and burying them, that hopefully this would come true. Now, the thing that we're kind of lucky about is, of course, if you bury lead in the ground, there's a good chance that it's going to survive, right? It's more hardy or robust than, say, wood or leather and stuff like that. So we find a lot of these, right? And we can translate them. And so you can see all the writing on this, right? And here's another one. Some of them are kind of beaten down, but you can see some of the scribbling on it here kind of barely. But what's kind of interesting is to say, first of all, we find so many of them, and people seem to have done this to try to kind of affect changes in their life. And when you read them, they can be kind of humorous because, as I say, so often they have to do with someone has stolen something from them and they want to get back at them. It has a lot to do with gambling, all sorts of things. So here's a few Sorry, my dog was barking there. That's what you heard. So, anyways, these are some of the. I mean, there's thousands of these things, of course, but some of them are kind of funny, right? When you see the curses, the language is sometimes it's just honestly like bad Latin because they're borderline illiterate or something. But it's interesting to see what people were mad about and what they try to, get to people. So take a look at this one. It says Solinus, that's a person's name, to the goddess Sulis Minerva. So that's just some sort of epithet for Minerva. I give to your divinity and majesty my bathing tunic and cloak. Do not allow sleep or health to him who has done me wrong, whether man or woman, or whether slave or free, unless he reveals himself and brings those goods to your temple. So somebody has stolen, when this guy went to the baths, has stolen his tunic and cloak. So he's kind of offering them up to the god and kind of saying to the goddess, don't give him any sleep that's done this to me. Right. Similarly, this next one says Docomedes, that's the person's name, has lost 2 gloves and asks that the thief responsible should lose their minds and eyes in the goddess's temple. So somebody keeps stealing this guy's gloves, so he writes this curse tablet so that hopefully he'll be blinded. And this last one, it says, I curse Tretia Maria. So this guy's cursing out this woman and her life and mind and memory and liver and lungs mixed up together, and her words, thoughts, and memories. Thus may she be unable to speak what things are concealed, nor be able. It's kind of tough to make what's going on here, but I suspect this might have something to do with some sort of erotic affair kind of gone wrong. It's what's kind of funny is that they always kind of load things up. They don't never just say, oh, I want this person to die. It's like, I want their mind and memory, their liver, their lungs. I want them mixed up. I want them to die. I want them to crash. I want them to burn. They kind of cover all the territory, just the hopes that one of them will come true. Right? So these are, in a sense, looking back, they're kind of silly or whatever, right? But they're so common, and what that does is that reflects this idea of these spirits that inhabited the world. And as I say, on one hand, we have Jupiter and all those, but just these day-to-day things, this animistic spirit. There's a huge belief in the evil eye. So people would wear all sorts of items and necklaces that were supposed to ward off these evil spirits. So it was a very I don't want to say mystic. What's the word I'm looking for here? Just these beliefs were very, very common. So it's just a very superstitious, I guess is the right word, society. It really just can't be underestimated. Okay. So there gives you a quick overview of some of the basic features of Roman religion, the similarities with Greece, but then also when we talk about these curse tablets, but then also you talk about animism and those kind of things. There's just something a little bit different, or more emphasis on that in Roman culture. So just realize that in Roman religious, there's a lot of variety in terms of beliefs and practices. Also, this idea of inclusivity, right? Romans are pretty accepting and tolerant of other religions, as long as it didn't really kind of threaten the public safety or the public peace. Pervasiveness, this is what I've just been emphasizing to you. From day-to-day life to state life to the affairs of the state, everything was pervaded by. There was very little that was apart or distinct from religion. And the other thing is that there's personal religion and state religion, and there's kind of crossover between these two. Okay, so just as people did things on a personal nature to ensure the goodwill of God, there was state. There was a venue for doing this for the state as well, and that is discussed in your state. In your textbook. So pay attention, especially in this chapter towards the end, where it gives a little summary and review of kind of comparing Greece and Rome and some other Mediterranean cultures. Okay, so say again, just for the family, I hope this slideshow has helped kind of flesh out the discussion in your textbook, and also just kind of alerted to you some of those features of Roman religion that are just kind of unique.